as I was driving in today, because the universe decided to give me, I wrote this nice speech that I'm not going to give now, because the universe decided to give me an hour and a half to get here. I think there was a reason for that. And I think part of it was it let me reflect on what I was going to say this morning, but also I had the opportunity, I was telling Kenji, to attend a community forum in Redwood City of parents that were advocating for their children to get better education. And so as I was driving thinking about that, it was very powerful. It was about a room this size that was packed. They were all Spanish-speaking families. And then outside the door was another 50 or 60 people that could not even see or hear what was going on, but they were determined to be at that event and send a message that their kids need to be taken better care of in their schools and in their neighborhoods. And it's a reflection that's a lot better than what I was going to say, that the community is looking for us to not only take care of their current needs, but they're looking for us to make real change. These families were standing up there. It was a very emotional, a lot of tears, talking about how their kids were not ready to go to high school, not ready to go to middle school, were told that they were failing, were in unsafe neighborhoods, not getting the response times and everything. And I think as we sit here and go through, the tedium of looking at our theories of changes and our business models and so forth, behind all that are the faces of these children and the faces of these parents that are desperate. And so I think if you keep that that kind of in the back of your mind, we are here to help you develop organizations that are sustainable. We're here to help you develop organizations that have scale. We have good panelists here today to lead you through that process, but that's a more mechanical process. I wanted to put in your mind the faces of these families and the faces of these children that you're all working for, and I know you all know that, but we don't do a good enough job of telling that story. And I think as we tell that story better, we're going to bring in the more additional money to our community, which is what one of our goals is, and you're going to be able to have a greater impact. So with that, let me tell you a little bit, in case there's anyone new that doesn't know what we do at the foundation. I put this slide together real quick so you can see and visually kind of things that we're working on over the course of the next couple years. Education is our main program. We are committed to, I guess I can't, so I'm sorry if you guys can't see because I can't move away yet. So education, providing quality education and helping kids be ready for graduation and ready for college and work. Dealing with the homelessness and affordable housing issue. We're committed to figuring out solutions for that, particularly around families. It's a tragedy that a number of children and families that are homeless in the Valley. We are committed to figuring out what we can do in the jobs front. If you're going to create a thriving Silicon Valley, you have to deal with the housing issue, you have to deal with the job issue. We have, at the top, I have to put a shout out to, at the top is Mara's daughter. So we start them young at the foundation. Reading good to great, I like that. So she's already in, her application is in, so we just need a few more years, but I love that picture. She's ready to go. But that's our effort to build, that's this effort, to build foundations, or to build nonprofits and organizations that are ready to be great. We're also very interested in promoting social entrepreneurship and social innovation. So we don't have anything particular in that area yet, but we're committed to doing that. And that is on the for-profit side and the nonprofit side. We hope that all of you would be able to consider yourselves social entrepreneurs down the road. And then the circle there is our symbol for the fact that we want to bring more philanthropic dollars into the community. We want to have additional people funding locally like we do. And the best way to do that, as I said at the last meeting, is we need your help to do that. We need you to tell your story better. We need you to understand your outcomes. We need you to understand how you're going to make a difference. We need to have you really make sustainable change. If we can do that, if we can tell that story, money will come into the community the way we want. So with that, I get to step aside, and we've been looking forward to this in the foundation because Kenji Trainer, our new, not so new anymore, but our new Senior Program Officer for Education is going to moderate this, and we've been giving him a lot of grief in the foundation for this, but he's going to be great. You're going to have a great time. It's a lot better than me talking. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kenji.
get ourselves situated here. Good morning. So, as Rick mentioned, my name is Kenji Trainer. I'm the Senior Program Officer for Education at the Sobrato Family Foundation. So pleased to be here with you this morning to engage in this dialogue, to sort of moderate a conversation with some brilliant folks that I think can really shed some light on an important topic. And I think, as Rick mentioned, this is a topic that gets a little bit more into sort of the nuts and bolts. We had the previous session in this series really focused on theories of change and logic models, very much about sort of what is our social purpose and getting clear about that in our organizations. And this, I think, will be a good opportunity today to continue thinking about that in the next level down around how do we really make sure that our organizations are set up with resources and cost structures and a lot of discipline around the finances to drive that impact that we want to see. So this is an important conversation, I think, and one that I'm happy to be engaged in both as a funder, because I have relationships with many of you and engage in these conversations with you about what's going on in your organizations when folks are submitting proposals and strategic plans and background documents to make sure that funders really understand how your organizations think about your effectiveness, both, again, on your social impact side, but also on your financial sustainability side. So as a funder, I always appreciate the chance to be in a wider conversation about these same things that I talk about pretty frequently with folks one-on-one. And also, in addition to my work in philanthropy, I've been involved in creating nonprofit organizations, trying to grow and scale it. And so I've actually been in exactly the seat that you're sitting in now, which is trying to figure out these hard and vexing questions around doing good work and then thinking through the best, most effective and efficient ways to resource that work and to really make sure that we get to both sustainability and to wider impacts. So quickly to overview the format for today, we want to try to keep it as a dialogue and as interactive as we can. Obviously, we also want to make sure we have a good opportunity to hear from the panelists. So we're going to start by moving through this morning with some panel conversation, really trying to cover sort of the basics around sort of what, why, and how in terms of business models. And then we'll take a break, have an opportunity for folks to start to think about questions, send some of your questions along to us, and really have devoted the time after the break entirely to Q&A and really to open this up and to get that exchange and interactivity going. So again, would like to actually, as I think everyone has on your chairs, biographical background for our panelists, but wanted to really welcome, and I'm so excited to have both Jahan Velji with us and Sam Cobbs, who are excellent leaders in the nonprofit space and have done a lot of work specifically around this issue of business models. So I think to get us grounded up here around sort of who's out in the room, wanted to just quickly do a little bit of polling. This is some of the interactive features that we're going to try to integrate throughout the day. I'm hoping most folks have used interactive text-based live polling. We have the instructions up there. You have to text the code based on the questions to the numbers that you see. And really, this is for us to get a sense of sort of who's in the room and where should we start to calibrate the conversation initially. So obviously, business model work will often depend on not only what kind of organization you are, but where are you in your organizational life cycle. And I think everyone sort of intuitively knows that business models and funding changes for organizations as they develop. So if you can just take a minute and we will see what the room holds. And it looks like, if we close the poll, that most of the room is sitting in this middle space of either growing or really having sort of a mature and sustained organizations. A few folks in the early stages, and thankfully no one who thinks that they are in a stagnant or position to decline, which is great. So the next poll we'll get a little further into, given that we now kind of have a sense of the maturity of organizations and now sort of looking at how does that relate to your revenue mix. Great, so it looks like we can close this poll. We haven't seen too many more results. And so interesting here to note a number of you are really utilizing strong support from private funders. A fair number of folks are moving to the space where they're really trying to look at the balance of your revenue streams with a mix of 2 or 3. And a smaller number of folks thinking of those earned income strategies are really tying your work to public funding. So obviously this falls, the business thinking and business modeling work falls on someone in the organization. You're the folks brave enough to come and sit through the panel, but we're also curious about in your organizations, do you have sort of the resident capacity and who's really present to do that thinking on the financial and business modeling side? All right, I think that'll probably capture most of the room. So interesting to see that we have an even split between organizations with a truly resident CFO, someone who's charged with making sense of the numbers, and then folks who are also working with some internal accounting staff and a substantial number who are actually still outsourcing bookkeeping and accounting functions. Last question for polling. And again, understanding sort of what are these building block pieces that we've been talking about: theory of change, logic model, strategic plan, and business plan, or business model, excuse me. Where is your organization at currently with your strategic work? Great. So on the strategic readiness question, it looks like we have a fair amount of the room holding on to a quality current strategic plan, something that you feel like is actually really directly applicable in guiding your work right now. Some folks that are probably thinking about it's time to update my plan, and then a few others who are operating without a current strategic plan in place. We were just having a conversation, super fascinated by the numbers in these 4 slides, and are going to quickly, impromptu, ask one more question just by a show of hands around total financial and budget size for your organization. So how many folks in the room are operating organizations that annually are working on $1 million or less? Okay. Folks in the $1 to $5 million range? $5 to $10 million? Wow. And above 10? All right. Pretty mixed. Great. So business models. The field has, I think, come to an interesting place in its development around, what is a strategic plan? I think most folks sort of have that message pretty clearly out there. Theory of change and logic models have certainly been a topic of conversation in the field for a long time, and a lot of work is going on there. Business modeling, I think, is a piece that's still in development and still up and coming in the field. And one of the ways that I think that's evidenced is as we were doing research and trying to get ready to have this conversation, even finding a single uniform definition around business model specifically tied to nonprofit organizations or relevant for the social sector was an interesting exercise to go through. So we definitely thought that it might be useful to start the conversation really just focus on the question of what is a business model. And again, having that really be grounded in sort of our understanding of that specifically for nonprofits, for the social sector, and recognizing again that there are some variations, I think, that are out there in the field around how people think about this, but thought it would be good to just start the conversation by posing to both Jahan and Sam and getting their sense of sort of the most essential elements that really would anchor our understanding of what is a business plan for nonprofits.
So the way I think about it is I start by thinking about a business plan, which essentially has both the kind of strategic component as well as the financial component. Some people call a business plan and a strategic plan, use those words interchangeably. I've seen many strategic plans that don't actually have the financials as part of it. So I kind of think of business plan or the ideal kind of strategic plan as having both the sort of components around the vision and the goals of the organization and its priorities, really grounded in the impact that the organization is trying to achieve and the theory of change and the logic model, but also showing, what is the cost structure that goes with that, the resources needed, as well as where the revenue is going to be coming from. And it's a very much of an iteration between what is the organization trying to achieve in terms of the impact, and what is a set of costs and revenues that can enable that impact to happen and to be sustained over time. So the business model piece, costs and revenue, I guess the other term I wanted to throw out that also comes up is funding model. I think of the funding model as just the revenue piece of that within the business model. So sort of business plan overall ideally is the same as a strategic plan, which would have both the programmatic and the financial elements. Financial elements, I consider the business model. A subset of the business model is the funding model. Sam, interested in your thoughts.
I don't have much to add to that. I think Jahan has articulated it very well. The point that I would underline is really around the intended impact of the organization, and starting there with what is the impact, and then how is it that you're going to achieve that impact, how much is it actually going to cost you, and how are you going to sustain it over time.
Interesting. So we have the graphic here pulling from what we just heard about sort of the interplay between strategic direction, this real clarity around impact, theory of change, logic model, where some of that would be codified, and then the business model components. And interesting to hear that folks, both Jahan and Sam, talked about the business model as getting clear on what it takes to actually start doing the work. And then Sam, I think, made a great point about sort of the sustainability piece. And so that sort of leads us into, why? What's the purpose of doing the business modeling work? And when, if you're an organization, can you think about starting to have this come into the mix as you're doing, a lot of your priority setting and getting clear on your directions? So, wondering if maybe either of you can talk about sort of how you've evolved. Jahan, maybe for your case in working with organizations, seen them go through those different pieces, and sort of when has some of the business modeling work come into play?
And my perspective is that whenever you're doing a strategic plan, you need to include the business model aspect of it, because you can talk about the impact you're trying to have and the priorities that you have in trying to achieve that impact. But unless you can really make sure that it's fundable, it's not going to work. And I think to really have a robust plan that you can take to funders, potential donors, to really show them that you've thought it through, it's important to have the business model component. So I would suggest that anytime you're doing a strategic plan, you look at the business model. And I think another situation where I would suggest that as well would be where your market is changing rapidly, where there are potential changes, if you're government funded, changes in policy or legislation, where there's sort of a new set of donors you think you could tap into to support your needs. I think it's not about chasing where the funding is, but it's really about anchoring on what you're trying to accomplish and what are the sources out there. So I think those are two situations where it's really important to think through the financial aspect, not just the programmatic aspect.
So, it was interesting that on Rick's slide he had good to great up there, and one of the things that Jim Collins talks about in good to great, and as well as great by choice, that in order to become a great organization, a great company, that greatness is not something that happens by accident. It is based on having intentional and disciplined actions. And so the why around having a business model is that you actually have to, I believe, have an understanding of what are the intentional consequences that you're making when you decide to go after funding and receive certain funding, because you need to have a blueprint around that, or else you can possibly find yourself adrift. A lot of people talk about, well, mission drift, and I'll never chase the money. Well, I often say, well, how do you know you won't chase the money if you've never been broke? And if you don't know what it is that you're trying, what puzzle you're trying to fit together. So that is a why of understanding why you need this business model, because it actually helps you become much more disciplined about what it is that you do, what type of funding you actually go after and you actually received. And that discipline leads to then being much more intentional, which then leads to an organization in a level of greatness.
And if I could just add to that, I think what Sam said is absolutely right in terms of the intentionality it gives you and the ability to make choices about what you are going to take on and what you're not going to take on. Nonprofits are faced with lots of opportunities every day of different services you could provide, funders you could work with, and how do you really make those choices unless you really understand the cost to your organization to deliver those services and how they fit in with the larger impact that you're trying to achieve and the pieces that you've determined based on the hard work you've done around your theory of change about what those elements need to be. So I think this kind of notion of intentionality and choices is really important, and the business modeling kind of gives you some of the data you need to be able to make some of those choices.
And just one more quick piece, and I feel like I need to set some context for myself here, and so I need that discipline because I'm a trained social worker by heart, and social workers, we hate saying no. We don't like saying no, so I need that blueprint and that discipline to keep me focused on what it is that I'm trying to do, because you say, hey, you can help more kids. Initially, I'm all for it, but I really need to be able to understand it from a business perspective. And I know there are some people who are much more business minded that they may not necessarily need that discipline. But I often say I had to get 2 promotions to be a case manager. And so I come from a social work background. And so I need that discipline to make sure that I am moving the organization in the direction that I need to move it as the CEO.
And so picking up on this idea of movement and direction with intentionality and discipline, I'm wondering if either or both of you can also sort of speak to the why, again, relative to what we heard from organizations about their stage of maturity, and thinking through about the value of business planning, whether your organization is essentially stable in your current scale, or whether folks are really on a growth trajectory, and any thoughts that you might have about sort of the value and importance of this work regardless of your stage.
Yeah, I would, as I look at the slides around growth and around mature, sustainable organizations, and then I look at the size of the budget, it brings up a couple of things for me. One thing is that, when something is all nice, shiny, pretty, and new, and you're growing, that oftentimes that is the easiest money for you to get. Foundations, individuals, they all sorry for the foundation people, they like shiny new objects. They like new, creative, innovative things. And so you can get trapped in a financial model that means you have to continue to grow and you have to continue to create new and innovative things to bring in the dollars to sustain that baseline level of operation that you need. So then as you move into that mature and sustainable organization, the thing that I think about then is that is your funding model as such that you are truly maintaining and sustaining, or are you consistently needing to go out to find new sources of revenue to pay for what it is that you already do? We often talk a lot about in the organization that we need to find out new and creative ways to repackage and resell what it is that we've been doing for years if we're going to maintain our financial model, because, the new initiative over here around My Brother's Keeper, well, that really doesn't fit us. But if we need the dollars and we're not disciplined, we could actually try to fit ourselves into that pool. And so as you begin to think about that, are you raising more money? If you're a mature and sustaining organization, are you just raising more money to feed the operations that you've already built, and having an understanding of what that delta and what that gap is as you continue to grow and become one of those mature organizations?
And I've seen this play out with an organization that was operating on a national scale. They had sites in many states across the country, and they had gotten a large amount of money from a small group of foundations to really go out and grow. And so, they were growing like gangbusters and opening new sites and sending funds to the sites because, they had this big upfront raise they had from foundations. And as that money was sort of running out, they realized, okay, we've got a bunch of sites now, and we're providing services because we have to maintain the quality. We want to make sure that, that they're actually delivering the services and getting the outcomes. And they were working with, youth that were primarily high school dropouts or at risk of dropping out. And they were faced with a real question about how do we sustain the growth that we have? How do we maintain quality if we don't have this big influx of capital? And basically they had to rethink what kind of support they were providing to sites, and they had to do that in a more streamlined way because there simply wasn't the capital coming in to be able to do everything that they had been doing before. And I think part of the process for them was really understanding how much was it costing them to support the more mature sites as opposed to the new ones. And when they did that analysis, they realized that they could not raise that kind of money over time. So they had to kind of make their cost structure leaner and prioritize the kind of support they were offering to really drive quality and basically, renegotiate the relationship they have with their sites. And so, that's an example from a national organization, but that could apply as well for a local organization with multiple locations. Just really thinking about, what is the flow there, and what does it really take to deliver the service, and where is that money going to come from?
So, with this clarity about the what, obviously having heard a number of reasons, both aspirational and some a little bit of a cautionary tale about the why, would love to sort of shift a little bit to hear from both of you about your thoughts on how organizations can start to get into doing that analysis, can start to build that intentionality and internal discipline, particularly around the financial side, given that we saw, folks are further along with having strategic plans, but really the next level down with the business model. And wondering maybe if, Jahan, you can start by talking about some of that kind of internal analysis that this organization may have done, or that you think is helpful for frankly any organization to do about sort of funding and costs and how those things line up.
Mm-hmm. And I think it really does start with the cost piece. And one of the background pieces was costs are cool. It's a very old piece. It's more than 10 years old, but I think it just hits a real fundamental about understanding the cost structure of the programs that you're doing, kind of each individual program and how they add up to your organization as a whole. So this type of matrix can be used to look at on the y-axis, how closely does the program that you're looking at really align with your mission? And then on the x-axis, it's really looking at the financial contributions. So take revenue minus cost for that particular program. Where are you on that line? And ideally, you want to be in a place where you're both kind of generating revenue, you're getting more than enough revenue to deliver the service you're delivering, and it's really aligned with your mission. The reality is that doesn't happen that much in the nonprofit sector. That tends to be more of a for-profit model where there's that excess, which is the profit. But in the nonprofit sector, then you basically are looking more at the other three quadrants. I'll take the bottom left quadrant, the potential distraction, as something that not only is it not aligned with your mission, but when you actually do the analysis, you find that you're losing money. Every time you serve that kid, or every time you're delivering that service, you're losing money. And that is a problem if it's not really aligned with your mission. So, do you have that understanding about your programs and where they fit? Is there someone else that can take on that service that might be more aligned with their mission, and they might be willing to subsidize it? But do you really need to continue doing that? I think the other piece, if you look in the upper left, is organization or a program that actually has a negative financial contribution but is very closely aligned with your mission. One of the organizations I'm working with now does some Head Start programming, and what they do and kind of the way they deliver it, they realize that on that contract they actually lose money. Every kid they serve, they are going to lose some money, but they've made the choice to do that because that is a core part of the service. They're building out a continuum of services in a really, really challenged neighborhood, and it's important for them to be able to have that kind of early connection with kids in that community. So they know they're going to require funding, and they're going to go out and have to raise that money privately. So it's not that you shouldn't do it if it has a negative financial contribution, but you need to be, this is where the intentionality and the choice making really comes in. And also understanding, well, what is the magnitude of additional funding that's required? Because they can choose to take on a certain number of kids in that program, but they also have to be comfortable with whatever that fundraising burden is going to be. And it might be fine at a certain level, but as they take on more youth and scale, if it gets too big or takes away from funding from some of the other things they're doing, they're really going to have to make a choice about that. The bottom right, I think, is less prevalent, but I think a lot of people think that it's happening a lot more, which is you get some funding to do something. It's not really aligned with your mission, but hey, we got a grant, we're going to do this. And you think that it's going to cover your costs, or you think maybe it'll even subsidize some other stuff that you're doing. But once you actually look at your costs, you realize, no, that's not actually happening, and we're actually in the bottom left. So, I think this can be helpful to just think about, and it could be a useful exercise to do with your team on kind of where are our programs or program, where does it fit on this matrix, and what does that say? If there's something that has negative financial contribution, are there ways you can play with the economics to actually make it more attractive financially or require less subsidy? So it kind of gives you a place to start, grounding in the cost, but also looking at the revenue side, and again, really grounding also in the mission. What are you trying to accomplish? And I think that's a theme for this conversation, because you can't look at your business model in isolation of the impact you're trying to have. And I think organizations that realize that those two things really go together are going to be better off. And of the organizations I've worked with where I've seen that, they're going to be better off in terms of delivering the impact that they want to deliver, as well as being able to sustain themselves. So I know that was a lot, but I just I wanted to provide a little bit more background on that for folks who didn't get a chance to read the piece.
So, and I think we're going to get into this a little bit deeper. It is, when we say look at the cost, we really mean look at the cost. Not just, I have to hire 2 new teachers, or I have to hire 2 new case managers that's going to go out and do this work. They're only going to cost me $150,000 to hire. The grant is for $300,000. Well, but those aren't the only costs. You got, what are the reporting costs? You got people who have to write reports, who have to report back to the funder. If it's a government funder, you have people who have to go to meetings. Government loves meetings, to actually attend those things. And so you really have to understand and go deep into the cost of what does it actually cost you to provide a unit of service, and is this funding actually helping you do that, and is this program overall helping you understand, are you getting to a better financial sustainability? One of the things that Bridgespan and NFF put out when we hit the economic downturn was how to really actually go through and look at cost that says, okay, should you close down a program or not? And just because, and if you don't understand the cost of your organization and what's driving that cost, because you have a program, let's just say you have a residential shelter that's costing you $1 million, and you say, hey, if I close this program, I'm going to save $1 million. Well, you're actually not. Because what's built into that $1 million, if you have a program director that also supervises 3 or 4 of your other programs, you're not going to reduce his or her staff or his or her salary because you close down that program. You have financial people who are built into that $1 million budget. You're not going to reduce their staff, reduce them, or lay them off because you close down that program. And so you have to really understand not only what your costs are, but what's driving your costs, so that you can make these critical decisions when you begin to look at this matrix around, is a program a clear winner? Is it actually generating funding? Or are we losing money on this? And it may, as Jahan said, it may be okay to lose money on it, but you have to look at it from a scale. If you're serving 300 kids now and it's costing you $1,000 a month subsidy, well, $300,000 a month, that may be okay. But then if you double that and you're now serving 600, is that still okay with the fundraising burden that you have to do? And those are the questions that you have to actually ask yourself. But first, you truly have to understand what your costs are and what drives those costs.
I think there's also another element to look at, which is scale. It could be serving you a certain amount it could be costing a certain amount to serve a number of youth that you have, let's say the 300 youth. Part of that is driven by the variable costs that every youth, there's a certain amount you have to give them. There's, housing or education or employment, whatever those services are. But if you look at your full cost to serve those youth, you're also then layering in a portion of your overhead cost, your management time that goes, to supervising the program. So as you scale, it could be that your cost per youth that you're serving actually goes down over time because that overhead gets spread out over more youth. So that's another thing to think about when you look at your economics. It could be that you're operating in a subscale way, and if you actually grow, you would be able to lower your cost per youth, reducing the amount of subsidy that you might, or additional fundraising that you need to do, or maybe for the same amount of fundraising, you could kind of spread that out over more youth because whatever let's say your fee for service or your government reimbursement, can actually cover more of that. So, that's another factor to think about. So again, when you kind of have that matrix and you kind of understand your costs, you can also think about, okay, what do we think this looks like over time? What does this say about the priorities, about where we should grow and where that will take our economics? I know a number of organizations said that you're kind of in a growth and scaling mode. So many times when people do business plans and they do that analysis of what the costs look like over time, they also look at what is your cost per youth or your cost to serve, how does that come down over time as you achieve greater economies of scale?
So quickly, we sort of have a slide, I think, that actually touches on a lot of what we just heard around getting clear, obviously, as you think about doing the business model work around what's your current baseline, obviously the strategic clarity, and then I think you've just heard a lot about sort of testing these assumptions, stating these assumptions, testing them clearly, being able to pull apart the revenue mix and the expenses, and then generating some kind of analysis on that. Wondering if we can also, to Jahan's point, look at, we have sort of a hypothetical example around revenue model that ties exactly into sort of what Jahan was talking about, is getting really clear on this and then being able to see how does this revenue mix change over time, how does cost per participant change over time, and to be able to actually get yourself with confidence moving on this kind of trajectory. Doing this sort of analysis is really essential. And especially actually noting on some of these hypotheticals where, for example, to Sam's point about reporting, right, and about impact measurement, and about these other costs that are not necessarily always in your mind about your specific program, as this organization hypothetically grew, so did its R&D and evaluation expense, right? Proportionally, relative to its staffing, relative to its infrastructure, the more clients we're serving, the better we've gotten about capturing our impact, actually using that impact data to continue to make a strong case about why our organization is cost efficient and effective. That has required this growth in the R&D, even though it's been able to allow them to drive the cost per client down at the same time. So wanted to also, since we've been talking a little bit in the hypothetical, give Sam a few minutes to talk really specifically about his organization as an actual nonprofit that has gone through this hard work and been able to think about their business model and their impact and scaling in a lot of these aspects of the conversation so far.
So, as I think about and begin this piece of it, there are a couple of things that I want to start with. One is that I know the first session you did was on logic models and theories of change. Well, the secret that maybe they didn't tell you, but I'll actually tell you, is that it costs more to actually create an outcome versus just having an input or an output. That when you are intentionally trying to create a level of impact and you go through your theory of change, you're going to find that there are things that you should be doing to increase this impact that you're not doing. And if you're going to stay disciplined with that, you're going to have to add those things into your program. Doesn't always happen, but most of the time it actually does. So the first thing is that impact and outcomes cost more. They should go down as you get better and more experience in doing it, but they cost more. The second thing that you should understand before you really begin this journey is that this is something that I learned from Jahan. We've worked together for a very long time, is that the nonprofit sector doesn't always work like the corporate sector, and that money doesn't always flow to the organizations that are doing the best work. Just doesn't. It doesn't work that way. I know we're trying to make some inroads and we're trying to change and find what works, but everybody ain't caught that bug yet. And so oftentimes the dollars don't flow to you because you're doing the best work. And so I want to layer that as I begin to kind of walk you through a couple of our slides around revenue and around I think around expenses as well. So what you'll see is that you'll see in 2008 we had a budget of about $5.9 million, and this is when we actually went through our first theory of change and outlined our intended impact and what it is that we wanted to do with young people and for young people. And we had always had, thoughts about, we wanted young people to be self-sufficient after they left the program. We wanted to increase the level of self-sufficiency. However, we weren't doing anything around employment and education. So how can you, again, around intentional impact, how can you impact sustainability and self-sufficiency without helping young people, and we work with young people who are transitioning out of foster care, continue on their education, move into career ladder types of jobs, if you're just expecting that to happen by accident. And so in the for-profit sector, they would say, that's a piece of your core business. And you never outsource what is a piece of your core business. Regardless of the outsourcing that you do, you never outsource that piece. So as we began to look at that, we quickly understood that we weren't doing the things to intentionally drive the impact that we wanted to drive. So we needed to add some of those things in. And so then, therefore, our cost per program really began, or our cost per kid really increased at that time. We went from having one of the lowest cost on the block for being able to serve young people to having one of the highest cost. And we had to consistently go back and explain, why was this the case? One of the reasons that this was the case for us is we have evaluators that want to come and they want to do evaluations, and they say, we want to understand the impact of housing. Well, what my board said, we don't have to spend millions of dollars to be able to make the conclusion that someone who has a place to stay is going to be better off than someone who doesn't have a place to stay. Like, do we really have to spend money and go through all of the pain to figure that out? And so what we talked about is that there is an impact that just having housing is going to do. You're going to be healthier, you're going to be more focused just because you have a place to sleep. However, we wanted to go beyond what is that initial housing impact to a level of stickiness that said young people not only would be better off when they left us, but they will continue to progress. And when you look at them versus their peers who hadn't been through our program and at that time hadn't received any support, that they were going to be substantially better off in their 20s, in their 30s, than the young people who hadn't had the opportunity of the program. And as we began to look at that, that really began to change our cost structure. And as you see, we went from a $5.9 million organization in 2008 to currently around a $13.1 million organization, and then looking at the end of this business plan, looking at a revenue target of about $21.4 million. What you will also see in there is that the change in public to private. And so this is not an accidental change. And so if you go to the funding mix, the next slide around funding mix, you'll see that this is what you will notice is that this is not an accidental change. What's not up here is 2005, the organization had a budget of about $1.4 million. And it was really about 70% private and about 30% government funding. And when we began to look at that and began to understand what that meant and that we wanted to go to scale, what we found was we had a deal with government that we subsidized 60 cents on the dollar that we would actually go out and raise. And that was fine for us to do for 30 kids. But we were talking about going, doing something astronomical and going to 90 kids. Well, that would essentially triple that cost, and that was unsustainable to continue to raise 60 cents on a dollar to provide a service. And so part of our theory of change wasn't just about what we do around program. We're also believers in impact and changing policy that creates and sustains the problems that we're actually dealing with. And so we undertook a real thorough strategic planning process that said, okay, we really have two strategies. One is to provide direct service to the young people that we see every day and to help increase their self-sufficiency. But our end game around that is not to serve every young person in California, not to serve every young person in America. Our end game around that is to actually use our productive programs to influence policy, that we can actually change how money flows through the system. There was a show on HBO a few years ago called The Wire, and it was about drug gangs in Baltimore. And one of the things, they brought in an older detective, and one of the things he said, the first thing you have to do is you got to follow the money. You got to understand where the money is coming from and how it is flowing in and how it's flowing back out. You can't do anything until you understand that. So we had to make sure that we understood how the money was flowing and where we could actually have leverage by using our policy and our advocacy that stands on the shoulder of good programmatic outcomes to change how that actually goes. So in 2005, we were leveraging that 60 cents on a dollar because of some of the advocacy work by us, others in this region, like the Bill Wilson Center, Abode Services, and others. We were actually in 2007 able to get the state to actually change how the funding mechanism that actually provided the services that paid for the services that we provided. So essentially overnight, we went from providing 60 cents on a dollar to providing more like 25 or 30 cents on a dollar. That had a significant bearing on how many kids we could actually work with, how much money we actually had to go out and fundraise to do that. And that is essentially what has sustained our growth of young people served using that actual funding source. But that was really a set of intentional thought that led to the creation of our policy and advocacy piece to be very specific around making sure that the clientele that we were serving had the dollars and that the dollars were flowing in the right place. So as you see, in 2008, we went from a 65 to 35%. Currently we're about 69 to 31%, and our goal is to get to 80-20. Now, this is our funding model. It is not going to be something that's going to work for everybody. We fundamentally believe that young people transitioning out of foster care have been removed from their homes, most times for good reason, and the government has actually said that these are our kids and that we need to support them beyond the age of 18 into adulthood. Okay, we've been able to make the case that with the right services, that you can not only support them to the age of 21, but you can actually help them become self-sufficient, and that they actually become givers into our mainstream society versus takers away from it. And so we believe that government has an active role to play in that. We also believe and understand that our issue is not an issue that touches the hearts of everybody that we talk to. It is complicated, it is messy, it is emotionally difficult for people to even think about and deal with. So we are not an organization that appeals a lot to the individual donor. Unless we catch them at the right time when that last kid is getting ready to leave and go off to college, and they're saying, wow, my kids couldn't do this, but it has to be at that right time. And if we're not lucky enough to catch them at that time, we're not an organization that those high-level donors invest big dollars in. We are an organization that foundations have invested big dollars in. But essentially the foundation dollars that they've invested in is growth, scale, proof of concept. Now, as we have did most of those things and we're continuing to move forward with evaluation, it is trying to make sure, how do we sustain what it is that we've built? The way I think about sustainability is, if I didn't do anything new, we didn't come up with any more creative ideas, if we just wanted to sustain the work that we were doing and we were still doing good, effective work, how much money could we raise year after year after year without getting into a starvation cycle? And we came upon this 80-20 model is where it is that we want to actually get to. And this is our funding mix. This is our financial model. And therefore, then we have to go back and we have to resource the organization that drives toward this model. An example of that is, I always find it amusing when we have individual donors that are giving us $10,000 a year. And when they call us, we flip over backward to go have lunch with them and do whatever it is that we want to do with them. Yet we have social workers who are placing young people in our programs, and if the young person stays there for a full year, that's about $72,000, and we get annoyed when they call us. So we have to change how we actually treat our donors, as well as pay much more attention to the people who actually drive our business model. And as you begin to think about your boards, this should go into how you're staffing your boards. What is it that actually drives your business model? And what are the expertise you need on the board that's going to drive your business model? And I know, sorry foundations, everybody wants to have board members who are contributing six figures and they're doing all of these great things. And wherever I go, the main thing that EDs and CEOs complain about is their boards and what they're not doing. And I often say that we all can't suck at it. That there has to be something fundamentally wrong if we're all bad. I haven't heard anybody yet say, oh, it's fantastic, it's terrific. If we're all bad, there has to be something fundamentally wrong. And I think the reason that is because we're trying to oftentimes staff our board with 60% of the people who are only probably for us going to drive 10 to 15% of the revenue. And so we need to think about that as we make decisions. And as you have conversations with your funding partners, I know they're coming on next, being able to articulate your rationale for doing things, but it has to go back with, what is your funding model that's the right model and the right business model for your organization?
I was just thinking, that was, I think, really clear in terms of what choices you've made, the mix that you're driving towards, and what that means for your organization. I just wanted to throw out another example, an organization that has tutors that work with kids who are behind in reading. And for this organization, a few years ago, they started out with a funding mix that looked a lot more like, I'd say about 15% earned revenue from school districts that would pay for the program to be there. Because even though the tutors are volunteers, you still need staff to kind of manage the reading center, and you have headquarters people who are also managing the program quality and collecting data. So they had, let's say about 15% fee for service, and the rest of their funding was all philanthropy. philanthropy and individuals. And I think helping kids in elementary school learn how to read is something that appeals to a lot more people than helping kids who are in foster care. And I think I don't think that should be the case, but I think that's the reality that we deal with in our society. And so in this case, this organization actually has a model where they're driving to more fee-for-service from districts. So a few years from now, they want to be closer to 45-50% fee-for-service, but they're still going to raise half their money from philanthropy and individuals, partly because they have a group out there that they can tap into. These services are happening in schools and communities, and they can tap into communities, even volunteers who get inspired about the program, they can give to the program. And so they have sort of a natural constituency that kind of funding mix actually makes sense for them. And so their business model, given the kinds of costs that they're incurring and the revenue mix, also implies that they need to have a lot of people really focused on private funding. And they need people, and some of the board members, like the one Sam was talking about, that a lot of people seem to want. Well, in this case, it's actually pretty important to what their mix is. They also need people who understand how school districts make decisions, and principals and teachers make decisions about what programs that they're going to work with. And they need to understand kind of the general policy environment out there that affects the kinds of funding, the Title I SES funding that those schools are using to pay for the services. So their board and what they're working toward is a board that actually aligns and has kind of different pieces that align with the different parts of their model. And so I think these are sort of two examples of how organizations really tie what their business model is to the impact that they're trying to have, and kind of where is the constituency for that impact. And how does that also mean they need to kind of structure and manage their own resources?
One just final resource for you. When I was, looking at business models and thinking about this early on, my board said, we want to be at a 50-50. And I say, why do we want to be at a 50-50? They say, well, because you can't get money from Irvine unless you are under 50%. I was like, well, Irvine typically gives $150,000, so you're not going to take $1 million from government so you can get $150 from Irvine? But there was no rationale behind why they wanted this model. And as I began to research, I came across two organizations. At that time, they both had a $95 million budget. One of them was the Harlem's Children's Zone. Of their $95 million budget at that time, about 90% of it was from private philanthropy. There was also an organization in Cincinnati, Ohio, called Lighthouse Youth Services. They had a $95 million budget too. 90% of their funding was from public. So you had two $95 million organizations, but had a totally different funding mix. And my point is because that was the mix that worked for what it was that they were trying to impact and trying to do. And so as you begin to go back and you begin to look at this and struggle with this, the key thing comes back to what is the impact that you're trying to make for those young people, for those families, for the constituents that you're actually serving. And that's what should drive your actual, your funding model and your business model.
And Rick was talking about, telling a story. I mean, doing this analysis and connecting the business model to your impact model or your theory of change, I mean, that really allows you to tell a story. That allows you to go to a funder and say, this is what we're trying to do, and this is why, and here's why we need your help. And I know, I've done different things in my career. I'm currently in the funder seat, so I know that funders have their own priorities and they change, and it can be really annoying. And I get all that. I think, but I will tell you that when organizations are able to tell a more compelling story about what they're trying to do and why, what it's going to cost, and how they're going to fund it, and how a funder can help in that, that gives a lot more confidence in the organization's ability to actually deliver on it than an organization who comes with a strategic plan that has no numbers with it, who is sort of like, well, we're just going to keep raising the same amount of money we've always raised because we've always done it. I mean, it's just not that compelling. And again, different funders have different priorities, and are funding organizations at different stages. So knowing kind of generally your audience is important, but within that, I think you really can tell a more effective story if you go through some of this work.
So That was a lot to hear, very clear, very compelling. I think based now on what you've heard, we want to actually get back to a little bit of the interactivity, do a little bit more polling, and really sort of with this discussion about the what, the why, the how, kind of put out to you, do you think your organization actually has done this work, or where are you with your own development of a business model? Okay, so interesting to see that we have a relatively small number of folks that have gotten to the point where they feel like they have the sustainable, clear business model. Definitely a good number of folks that are, I think, working on getting beyond the single-year view and working on this budget projection of at least 3 years. But a substantial number of folks in the room that are still really looking sort of on a yearly basis about your funds and the funds available and how do you put that to use. So I think this is going to help inform the exchange that we have coming up. So cognizant of time, I think we're going to try to take a short break, but really want to encourage you, based on everything that you've heard, to think about questions. And we're going to open it up on the poll. We're probably not going to broadcast all of them right now, but during the break, the poll will be open. This is an open-ended poll. Just start shooting questions in. We're going to take them, synthesize some of them, and use those to kick off the Q&A after the break. And then we'll, I think, also have an opportunity, depending on time, to pass a mic around and get some live questions going as well. But given that we think there's probably some similar questions in the room, if we can start by having them come through the poll, we'll try and group some similar questions together and kick off the Q&A that way. Looking at the clock, I think we'll give ourselves no more than 10 minutes, so we'll try to reconvene by 5 to the hour.